Okay. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I'm happy to see a lot of faces that I don't recognize and a lot of faces that I do recognize. So welcome to this Existential Hope Meetup, as we've called it. Today we're going to discuss the concept of existential hope. What is it? And if we think it's maybe useful, maybe it's underestimated, maybe we should use it more, or maybe it's overrated. We'll see. So I'm Beatrice. I work at an organization called Foresight Institute, and the Foresight Institute is a non-profit founded in the Bay Area in 1986. So it has like a few years on the neck, as we would say in Swedish. And yeah, so originally it was founded on this vision of like nanotech and how we can have nanotech do good for humanity, basically. But now we're focusing more broadly on a few different technologies and trying to consider just beneficial applications of certain technologies and trying to make them go well for humanity. Yeah, so in terms of the Foresight team in Sweden, that's me. We're a remote team, so whenever someone asks me where our office is, it's in my apartment. And yeah, we thought it would be fun to bring people together here because there was this conference this weekend, and so we had like all these interesting people in Stockholm, and we just wanted to take that opportunity to discuss these questions here, and we wanted to collaborate with Impact Academy. So welcome, Ville.
Thank you, Beatrice. Yeah, I'm Ville. I am the proud co-founder of Impact Academy, and we have existed for, I guess, a month, so a few days on our neck, so to speak. And we are an educational and field-building organization trying to equip young people from all over the world with to help us contribute to flourishing futures. We just wrapped up our first program called Future Academy, and we have some fellows here, which I am very happy to see. And with that, we'll kick it off. As Beatrice said, where am I on this thingy? There we go. The purpose of this is simply to explore existential hope, what it might mean, and if it's useful for us. And the approach, the agenda for the day is quite straightforward. You have all had a little bit of meet and greet. Please grab fika and stuff if you want. Then Beatrice is going to lead us through fireside chats with our lovely panelists, or lovely fireside chat speakers. And then I'm going to host a panel where you're going to get an opportunity to ask questions. So if you come up with a really good question, then keep it for the panel. And then there will be a light dinner and some free discussions at the end. We're going to be out of here by 9 o'clock, but if you're having super duper interesting conversations and want to keep having them, there is a cool bar super close, Sky Bar, so I suggest that couple people can go there and continue the night. And with that, I am going to turn to Beatrice.
Yes, so we start here. This is a concept that I think a lot of people are familiar with. I think everyone who was at this conference, EEGX Nordics, this weekend definitely is familiar with this concept. I think it's pretty straightforward that existential risk, something threatening the destruction of the long-term potential of life, is something we should definitely pay a lot of attention and resources to. On the other hand, we have this concept of existential hope, and with this one, it's maybe not so straightforward that we want to pay attention to this. So existential hope is basically a little bit the opposite of existential risk. I guess it's something, thinking of like a future world where everything goes really, really well, and trying to sort of steer towards that and trying to achieve that. And so the concept originated from a paper by Oxford philosophers Toby Ord and Owen Cotton Barrett, where they wrote about this, where they try to define existential risk and existential hope. And they use this term eucatastrophe, which is the opposite of a catastrophe, meaning we have an event and instead of everything being like much worse off, everything is much better off. So we have a lot more expected value than after that event, than before that event, sorry. And so one example that they mentioned in the paper is the creation of life. So that one is, yeah, it's a big one, pretty big catastrophe. I tend to use a looser definition. Just want to preface that. When I think of eucatastrophes, that I had a workshop this weekend asking people of potential eucatastrophes, and we got ideas on everything from like redefining the financial system or like eradicating all infectious diseases. Like I tend to use a definition that goes more something like that. Yeah, so I think I'll hand it back to you, Ville.
Oh, thank you for that. So why might this be an interesting concept? Well, Beatrice kind of alluded to it here. So just realizing this, that there is things that can be just as like bad as existential risks are bad. There could be things that are just as good, but in the opposite direction, that is. And realizing that might be important in and of itself, because then we can actually try to find these things. And then, wow, there we go. And here, Toby Orden and Cottenberg also points out that having a framework for thinking about these questions might help us like do a better job of actually finding them. Moreover, we think that this can help people, motivate people to take action for the long-term future of humankind. So first of all, it's just a complementary framing. So some people might be attracted to risk framings and thinking that that induces them to take action towards doing good for humanity in the long run. Others might be less attracted to this type of framing and instead be more attracted to a hopeful framing. Moreover, there is research suggesting that hope in general induces more action than negative messages or risk-focused messages. This mainly comes from climate studies on climate change, but reason to believe that it pertains more generally to risks for the far long-term future. And then last but not least, there seems to be something good with just hope in and of itself as a concept to be equipped with as a human being. So it seems to be able to work as kind of a buffer that can protect us from losing motivation when the going gets tough, so to speak. It also seems to be correlated with many good things, such as just achieving good things generally in life. And with that little intro to existential hope, we're going to stop talking and we're going to invite our dear fireside chat speakers. So Anders, Risto, and Hayden.
We'll bring you on one at a time. So our first speaker is like the transhumanist superstar of Sweden. I recently even saw him appear in Aftonbladet, which is like the biggest newspaper, saying he was going to freeze his brain. So Anders is, I guess, a futurist and a researcher, and he's currently at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. And so, yeah, Anders, welcome. So when you speak, it's great if you speak into this. I'm just going to make sure we have audio. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me? Nope.
Yes, yeah. It should be.
Mute. Okay, can you hear me now? No. It says mute on question mark, which I find absolutely hilarious. Even it doesn't know if it's muted.
This is the thing about like advanced technology. Very difficult.
Yeah. Okay, let's see now. Yeah. And this is of course.
We need it for the recording. Sorry. Yeah.
It's of course obligatory whenever talking about advanced technology to have a PowerPoint or microphone to fail. Comedy would not be complete without it.
Hello.
Perfect.
Hello. Great. Yes. Haha.
Yeah. So thank you. Tack, Anders. Who, if you wouldn't mind, would you just like as briefly as possible, introduce yourself, and then tell people what you're working on, and maybe even why you think that is important and contributes to positive futures.
So I'm a lapsed computational neuroscientist who ended up in the Oxford Philosophy Department, where I took my interest in transhumanism and turned that into writing about the ethics and social impact of emerging technologies. And then I, after much bickering, agreed with Nick Bostrom that, yeah, actually existential risk does matter quite a lot. We need to understand that. And right now I've been slowly drifting towards working on the positive side of things. So I'm writing this gigantic book about the long-term future. Assuming we survive and get our act together, how good could it be? How much could we get? How grand could the future be? So that is kind of my big research project right now. And when it comes to existential hope...
Can you hold your mic?
Okay, yeah, a bit like this. Okay, yeah. When it comes to existential hope, of course, by now, I'm enough of a philosopher. I actually only have high school philosophy to my name, but don't tell the philosophy faculty that. But I started analyzing that. What's going on here? And when there are good things ahead of us, quite often we anticipate them. We start licking our lips. Oh, that's going to be enjoyable. But that's a very different thing from hoping for things. Anticipation can sometimes lead to disappointment. You're expecting a reward and you're not getting it. And when you get it, it's usually, yeah, it was about as good as you got it. The biggest, most addictive things is, of course, the things that are better than expected. But hope is a bit different. That doesn't deal with probability at all. That deals with there is a possibility that something good could happen. It might not even be that you know what that good thing could be. You're hoping for it. And as Ville said, it's important because it's strongly tied to action. It's kind of obvious when you look at the opposite of hope, despair. In despair, you don't think there is any option. There is no action you can take that makes things better. You don't expect to be pleasantly surprised. In fact, you more or less expect to be either bored or have a nasty disappointment. That means that the only rational action you can do there is not to move. It's essentially training you to learn helplessness, which is actually why despair, if you think about Catholic theology, is a sin, and why they actually make hope one of the cardinal virtues. Because if you have hope, you actually are motivated to take positive action. You might fail at that, that's fine, but you're at least trying to take action. And I think when thinking about our future in the large, it's important to develop a sense of existential hope. We have a hunger for hope in our culture. And unfortunately, as we're going to discuss probably, there is this idea that, oh yes, hope is for foolish people. The serious people are all very ironic and cynical about everything. And that is a realistic view, which means that indeed the world will become as bad as the cynics expect it to. While if we look historically and empirically, we find that actually quite a lot of foolish people have done very useful things that actually have turned out really well. So I think existential hope is a very important concept, the recognition that yes, there might be things ahead of us that are as good as the origin of life.
Wow, that's encouraging, yeah. And so how do you think about existential hope in relation to existential risk? Do you think about, like, how do we balance those?
I generally tend to think that the future can be very long and very good, and that is a strong reason to try to make sure it happens. So that's why we need to prevent early existential risk from wiping us out before we reach our potential. But how good could the future be? We don't know, and there might be much more value than we expected. The origin of life, as an example, is interesting because it added a new kind of value to the universe. Before that, there existed rocks and stars that might have some kind of intrinsic value, but life is much more plausible to have intrinsic value or generate value. That's interesting. Over the history of the universe, we have had at least one, and probably several cases where new kinds of value come into being. And it would be rather weird if we are it. We have finally reached all the possible values. Indeed, there might be new kinds of value in the future. This leads to profound uncertainty, because we can't know what these values are, just that they might be extremely valuable. It also leads to epistemic humbleness. We need to be open for these possibilities. And that humbleness means both, of course, that we need to be rather careful with our thinking. We don't want to lock in the future too much, because if we do that, we might lock out certain potential values that we don't know about. It also means that we should be rather careful about our options, both for fixing things and especially when we pursue attempts at reducing existential risks. Right, as a good example, we have a current debate about AI risk. On one hand, I think there are good reasons to be very concerned about the rapid development of AI and to get AI safety right. But I do think many critics of concern about AI doom are also right, that yes, if we legislate in the wrong way right now, if we get too scared, we might miss out on all the good things that actually make AI potentially a way of getting to those higher values, to that glorious grand future.
Wonderful. I'm going to ask you one more question before we bring the next speaker on, which is, what are you most concerned about right now and excited about in your field?
So AI is a kind of an obvious case here. I'm actually very excited and all stressed out by it because I'm trying to figure out how can I get that to help me in my research. And mostly I discovered that it's mostly messing up stuff, but quite often in interesting ways. And it's kind of triggering me to think about what other research I need to do. There are definite real problems with AI development right now, but there is also great opportunities. But in the larger, I think we're seeing this with a lot of fields. Back in the 90s, when we were starting the Swedish Transhumanist Association and envisioning the future, or even in the early 90s, when I was on the Extropians list and met the people from the Foresight Institute online, our visions of the 2020s, they were kind of naive. We imagined various technology arriving much earlier than they did. Nanotechnology, unfortunately, got delayed quite a bit. We didn't know really where AI was. Space, we looked very, very far away. Biotechnology, well, we're expecting good things, and the life extension should be done by the end of the 90s, right? Instead, things arrive at a different order. But right now, a lot of the things we were dreaming about are happening, which is quite often, of course, not that reassuring, because your dreams are not always nice when you encounter them in real life and both realize that we need to fix the bugs here and we need to pay for them. And oh no, who are the other people using these interesting dream technologies? But actually, a lot of the visions are happening right now. That is exhilarating to the extreme. You don't need to be a believer in an imminent technological singularity to recognize that this is going to be a pretty awesome decade. It's going to be turbulent, it's going to be interesting in the may you live in interesting times perspective. But that also means that we have a really important role as future-oriented people who want to make the world a better place. We actually have our job cut out for us. We need to do things. It's going to be uncertain what we need to do. We're going to disagree with each other in many important ways. But it's so much better than being in a frozen era where we might dream about one day maybe these technologies exist. One day maybe politics could change. One day maybe the world system would be shifting. They are all changing right now, and it's kind of up to us to get involved with that.
Well, wow, I'm impressed you were like finding the extropianism stuff in the early 90s from here.
That was the first thing I did when I got onto the internet in August 1991. I learned how to use Usenet, and then I found the Extropian mailing list and subscribed to it.
That's amazing. I recommend the Foresight newsletter now, by the way. So yeah, I think, and also it's very encouraging to hear you say that we have an awesome decade ahead instead of like terrifying, which I think is where maybe most people go, or yeah, I go. So yeah, thank you, Anders.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, so Anders already mentioned AI a few times. It's going to shape the next decade and decades to come. And so our next speaker is Risto Uk. He is a policy researcher at the Future of Life Institute, and I think he's focusing especially on the EU AI policy, EU AI Act. And previously, he worked at the World Economic Forum and did research for the European Commission. So welcome, Risto, come up. Thank you for coming in. Yes, take the mic from.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Anders, just like if you could introduce yourself and tell people what you're working on.
Sure. You already said that I work as an AI policy researcher at the Future of Life Institute. I work on the EU AI Act. So a couple of days ago, the EU AI Act actually had a 2-year anniversary. In 2021, in April, the European Commission released a draft to regulate AI. It's a very comprehensive regulation of AI. It focuses on basically all AI systems, not just a specific category. It tries to focus on almost all domains where AI could be used. So it's a very comprehensive and very broad AI regulation. And I've been working on that basically from day one. Our focus has been on trying to get general purpose AI systems in the scope of that regulation. So systems like ChatGPT, GPT-4 now, systems that don't have a single purpose but can be used for a wide range of things. That's been our main focus. And right now, it is actually in the scope. The European Parliament is currently trying to finish their position, and they are negotiating, and it looks like the general purpose AI systems will be in. And the Council also, in December 22, they had general purpose AI systems also in. The European Commission, the initial draft, didn't have those in. So that's been my main focus area recently.
Great. It would also be very interesting to hear if you wanted to expand on like why you think your work is important in creating flourishing futures.
Yeah. So I think AI, of course, has a lot of upside. It can people have all kinds of utopian visions for AI. Maybe it could help us solve cancer and climate change and all kinds of really pressing issues, global poverty or whatnot. But AI obviously can have all kinds of risks as well. For example, just a couple of days ago, there was an incident where in the US, a mother got a phone call and heard that her daughter had been captured by a man, and the man was asking for $1 million to get the daughter back. In the background, she could hear her daughter crying, and everything was very real. But actually, that was all fake. Luckily, that incident didn't go through because she asked her another family member about that, and they were able to check that her daughter was actually on a ski trip. But there could be all kinds of incidents from AI. AI could be used in critical infrastructure that could lead to harms. AI could be used to decide who gets some kind of social welfare, and there could be mistakes. People might not get a loan. All kinds of risks could happen. And the EU AI Act tries to focus on those kinds of things. And of course, this is just the European Union. It's just 450 million plus people. That's a lot of people, but it's not the entire world. But the EU has this good aspect to it that it can actually influence the rest of the world. For example, the data privacy regulation that the EU enforced in 2018, that actually has led to the entire world to an extent having some kind of privacy-related regulation, especially the US, for example. There was in California a privacy regulation that California implemented. And that similar kind of thing can happen with AI, and that's what I'm hopeful of. Maybe American companies will actually take some of these ideas on and implement them.
Yeah. So I know that the Future of Life Institute does quite a bit of thinking on like world building and flourishing futures, but I would be interested to hear if you have ever thought about existential hope, if it means anything to you.
Yeah, at the Future of Life Institute, we recently had a project we called World Building, and we basically asked people to imagine it's year 2045, I think. We have some type of AGI, artificial general intelligence. Imagine that world, how did it go well? Like, imagine that we have that AGI, but we didn't actually end up in a very extreme negative scenario. It led to positive impact. What happened? And people were asked to imagine very concretely what led to positive impact. And I think we had like 200 submissions. People imagined all kinds of positive scenarios. And so FLI definitely focuses on positive futures as well. I have done a project together with UC Berkeley computer scientist Stuart Russell and some economists about positive AI economic futures. Imagining the type of world where most jobs could be automated by AI systems, how could we still have a positive world in that kind of scenario? Basically, humans cannot have a job anymore. All jobs can be done by AI systems. How can we still have a positive world in that kind of scenario? And many people react to that. Why is it a problem? Because people can just spend their time on like hobbies, basically. But actually, if you look into some psychological literature, it doesn't look so positive, because work gives people structure, it gives connections, it gives meaning. It's not so easy to get those outside work. You can do that, but you have to really work hard. Work gives that very easily to you, automatically. So we went around asking top economists like Darren Acemoglu, Eric Brynjolfsson, economists like that, and they came up with 5 positive scenarios from, for example, basically having government support for programs and like structured civic involvement and basically different kinds of or like basically creating in some way creating like support groups and I don't know sports groups and different kinds of job like things. That was one type of scenario that they came up with. Another was that people could still for a long time retrain themselves, move into find ways to still meaningfully contribute. Eventually that would maybe run out, but for some time they could still do that. And various other scenarios were given there as well. I think that was one example of how I directly work on positive futures.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and briefly, I'll just ask you also, like, would you say you've become more or less hopeful lately?
I think I've become probably less hopeful a little bit because currently I'm seeing a lot of racing in AI. Microsoft wants to add large language models, integrate them into every economic activity, basically. Recently, they even announced that they want to use large language models to control robots and drones. I think considering that we cannot really control these systems very well, we cannot make them output accurate things all the time. I'm not so happy about us integrating them into everything so quickly and so easily. And actually one of the researchers at OpenAI who is leading their AI safety team, Jan Leike, recently said that society should really think very hard before they integrate these systems into every economic activity. So because of that, I'm maybe more pessimistic than I would like to, but because of the UAI Act and how well it has progressed, and because of the Future of Life Institute's open letter, there's a lot of momentum to regulate these systems, ask if we want to automate every single thing using large language models. That maybe adds some hope.
Thank you for trying to end on the hope bit. So yeah, I also excited that you mentioned, for example, Darren Acemoglu, the economist. We're interviewing him on, we have an Existential Hope podcast at Foresight. So we're interviewing him, I think, next week or something, just a recommendation. We've also had Anders on the podcast, and I'm sure we'll have Hayden and Risto at some point in the future, if they're willing. So yeah, Hayden, I will introduce you now. So Hayden is our next speaker or panelist. Hayden is at the University of Cambridge's Center for the Study of Existential Risk. He has quite some experience with studying existential risk, and he's advised, I think, the UK and the US and the Singaporean governments and EU, UN, OECD, a lot of advice and a lot of, unfortunately. Well, welcome up on stage.
Hi.
Hi. Well, thank you for coming. And will you also share what you're working on and why or how and if you think it contributes to flourishing futures?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'm Hayden. So I used to work in politics in the UK, Labour Party politics, around 2014 to kind of 2017. And I don't know if any people know UK politics, but we had some general elections and some referendums, and they all went great. After this stunning record of success, I moved up to Cambridge to work on catastrophes because I was so used to them. And I've worked at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk now for the last 6 years. So we're a group of about 25 researchers at the University of Cambridge that work on a variety of different existential risks and risk in general. So pandemics, nuclear war, climate change, AI, systemic risks. Yeah, so that's what I've been working on, and hopefully, contributing by reducing some of these risks that unfortunately we face.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of catastrophes. Hopefully we'll also come up with some catastrophes then. It's a terrible, terrible word, the catastrophe word, because everyone just hears catastrophe when you say it. We've tried to actually come up with a few options, and I think, was it efflorescence for some reason won the bounty contest that we put out? Yeah. Anyway, what have you ever thought about existential hope, and what's your relationship to it?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting proposal, and kind of the thought and kind of inspiration. The thing that comes to my mind when I think of existential hope, there was a really promising young scholar in the field who unfortunately passed away a few months ago, a guy called Nathan Sears. And in his work, he explored this idea of existential security or existential safety. And I find that a very kind of motivating thought. So the idea is that we entered a kind of new era around 1945, where, which Toby Ord calls the era of the precipice, where we, to quote Martin Rees, who founded our center, for the first time in 445 million centuries, one species, us, had the power to destroy ourselves with nuclear war and with the massive increase in climate emissions and the massive increase in kind of technological power that we had in the post-war period. And so existential security or safety would be kind of reaching, if not the end, reaching, kind of stepping out of that precipice in some way, getting to some period where we are no longer facing these kinds of incredibly high risks. So I think that is one, that's quite a minimal level of existential hope. That's not the kind of grand futures. It's a bare minimum future, but it is a future. So that kind of idea of existential security and safety that Nathan worked on, and that I and others hope to kind of continue in our work to continue his legacy. Is something that I find motivating.
Yeah, I like that. I haven't really thought of it in that way, because oftentimes it is like scale or grandness or these things that come up. But I like that. It's a humble type of existential hope, I guess. And I'll ask you also, what has your journey been? Have you become less or more hopeful lately?
Yeah, I was thinking about this when you were asking the other panelists. So my job requires me to be a professional pessimist, but I'm quite a cheery bloke and normally an optimist. So I thought I'd balance both of those. So people have talked about AI, so maybe I'll cover a few different things. The last time I was here in Scandinavia was about kind of 4 years ago, back in 2019. And how have things gone over the last 4 years? Pretty bad. We kind of wasted a lot of those years on climate change, not reducing emissions as much as we should have. We've had this, disastrous pandemic that killed maybe 20 million people worldwide. So the fastest killer in terms of infectious diseases since probably the Spanish flu 100 years ago, though not the biggest killer. That dubious honor maybe goes to HIV/AIDS from the 80s and into the 90s. The pandemic, and what the pandemic also revealed is the kind of vulnerability, the systemic vulnerability of our society, the supply chains we all rely on, and how easily those can be kind of shaken and disrupted. And then, just to end on a really, really glum note, nuclear war. We're probably facing at least the worst situation for the last four decades. So at least the worst situation since 1983 with the Petrov incident, where we came very close to nuclear war. And I would argue maybe it's even worse than that. Maybe it's the worst in 60 years, because at least in the 80s and the 70s, you didn't have these explicit nuclear threats as Putin is now throwing around. And then, in addition to all those, that risk, a lot of the arms control agreements that have been set up over the last 50 years. Last year we celebrated 50 years since the signing of the Biological Weapons Convention and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972. A lot of those kind of treaties that have bound the major states and kind of constrain them have either been completely scrapped or are severely weakened. New START, Putin just pulled out of that, and it expires in 2026. Anyway, that's very depressing. So, but I'm a cheery guy. So, optimistically, I guess on climate change, I think in what the pandemic showed is that when governments want to act, they really can, and societies and companies and so on can operate together and respond very rapidly. And I think we're seeing some very hopeful things in the EU and the US in terms of these massive subsidies that are now going into clean energy. And we are also seeing that it's just in everyone's direct, selfish financial interest to invest in renewables and move as quickly as possible. So I think that is a good thing, right? It's not this constraint that we have to overcome. It's just go, go, go as quickly as possible. And then on kind of bioweapons and nuclear weapons, this is a very depressing thing. The invasion for everyone, and it's kind of unprecedented in many of our lifetimes, but it's not really unprecedented in kind of Cold War history. So there was a real strong movement to arms control in 1968, and that got delayed by the Soviet invasion of Prague. And then there was another kind of really big hopeful moment at the end of the 70s, which got kind of delayed, and things kind of fell apart because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But in both of those situations, a few years later, there were this real big progress on arms control agreements. So my hope would be that in a few years, once Putin has kind of realized what a colossal mistake he's made, that there will be this push again to have some sort of settlement and to have agreements that constrain nuclear weapons and biological weapons and so on. So that's my kind of
Yeah.
optimistic take.
So yeah, I think that's great. Just showing that there are things we can do, if the pandemic has brought anything positive, it's kind of show that governments can take action if they feel that it's urgent enough, and hopefully they get a growing sense of that now. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Ville now, because we're going to do a bit more back and forward panel. But thank you so much, guys, for doing this.
And thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Before I invite all of you to ask your question, I wanted to give the panel an opportunity. Is there something that you would like to comment on or ask any of the other guys here?
I might want to riff a little bit on your point there about the last few years. I think the pandemic is a beautiful example of not just showing how governments can come together, and also giving interesting examples of weird irrationalities hindering problems, but also that if you want to grade humanity on how well it handled the pandemic, you would probably give it an A, the highest score for the science part. We kind of quickly found the virus, we quickly sequenced it, and DeepMind, they quickly generated three-dimensional models of all the proteins. Whether that was useful or not is debatable, but at least they could do it, and we did it for free. And we got a vaccine in record speed, which was not just a scientific triumph, but also a little bit of an admin triumph. We can squeeze through this more quickly, and we now have organizations like 100 Days that are trying to make it even faster for the next pandemic or the next bioweapon or something like that. So I think we see a lot of very good examples here. We just need to remember them and make sure that we force people to remember them when they want to forget about that dreary pandemic, since there are other news. In 1918, there was a newspaper story where some intellectual was writing that, isn't it weird that we had this pandemic that killed millions of people recently and nobody's talking about it now? There was no response to that essay, and he never wrote about anything like that ever again. But I think we should learn from that to say, oh yeah, we are going to keep on banging on about how to protect ourselves against pandemics by these lessons.
Thank you, Anders. So, do we have anything in the crowd? We'll start with Valdemar, and if the question is to a specific panelist, please direct it to them.
Thank you. I would like to ask Hayden a follow-up question, namely of one thing that took my hopes for the future down a peg, namely how often we, global society responds to global catastrophic risks. Namely, it often is sort of what you told, that it's a go, go, go. Let's push all resources into one solution. Let's build an AI Act, a very large-scale solution that often is brittle, instead of trying to find dynamic solutions, finding specific targets. And this is, of course, difficult, more difficult, especially from a policies point of view, because you often, well, you're not doing anything because it's not a visible political action. How can this perhaps change towards being more dynamic, more appropriate to situation? Because after all, if you spend everything on climate change, you won't be able to spend anything on countering the next pandemic. After all, we live in a world of finite resources, despite money presses being turned on 24/7. So it's a difficult question, but perhaps we can find somewhere where we can start threading this.
Yeah, real simple, easy question to answer. So I completely agree that in seeking to address these kinds of risks, I think we should be trying lots and lots of different approaches, trying to be very experimental. I think that's one of the key findings from a lot of the resilience kind of literature, looking at responses to various disasters. Like, you want lots of different approaches. You want lots of. That's one way to increase resiliences. You try lots of different approaches. So I would definitely agree with that. On the other hand, I think we need to recognize that it's, big societal kind of responses, big government responses only come along every so often. And when things like that happen, I mean, so like the EU AI Act, right? Working on it for 2 years, it probably the standards will be finished in the next 2 years, and then implementation 1 year after that. So like, these things only come along every few, 5 years or 10 years or so. If you look at budgets, government budgets, they like very rarely shift. They only really shift in responses to kind of big shocks to the system. So I think we've got to have some combination in our minds of, trying lots of things, being experimental, trying to increase resilience by having lots of disconnected things. But then also, when these big kind of freight trains come through town, kind of grab hold and try and ride them as long as possible. So that's just one thought, but I'd like, I think that's a very rich theme that I'd like to discuss further. Anyone else want to? Yeah.
Just a couple of comments related to the EU AI Act. Obviously, governments do think about these issues of regulation not being very agile. If some kind of change happens in AI development, we need to change, we need to move toward taking the relevant precautions. And in the EU AI Act, a couple of things that people have discussed. For example, there will be some institutions that will be set up, for example, the European AI Board, or even an AI office, which could be a legal entity with its own resources that will help the European institutions to pay attention to the latest advancements in AI, give advice to how the regulation should change. There might be some mechanisms in the law that help lawmakers basically relatively quickly make amendments to the law. For example, add new high-risk use cases to the list, add new systems to the list. These kinds of things can also happen. And a lot of resources are put into, probably going to be put into member state level kind of enforcement authorities, market surveillance authorities, who could help also find out issues quickly. So there's some hope, I think.
So Anders, I think it was you who said that, who quoted "May you live in interesting times," and I agree. I also believe that the coming decade will probably be the most interesting of at least my life, and I assume most of the people in here. But I was thinking, so people don't necessarily respond to even positive change particularly well. So, like, how do you think society will respond to rapid change and even positive such? And do you think it will be like an eerie sense of like something like happening all the time? And like, yeah, I would like to hear your input on that.
There is a fair bit of theorizing that, yes, when you have a lot of change in society, that's where people feeling a lot of stress. That's where suicide rates go up, according to Emil Durkheim. I'm not certain that actually replicates in the modern era. But I think it's very true that future shock and the information stress are a thing. I think most of us experience it. And it's not because we have too limited options. It's just we have a lot of options, and many of them are good options. We have to choose between really interesting projects. We have an endless amount of information, but all would be delightful. And as we're trying to enjoy the latest Netflix movie, we realize that there might be something onto the Apple TV at the same time. And the day only has 24 hours. That kind of stress is in many ways is, of course, it's a psychological response. And I think it's something one needs to learn how to deal with. And I think our culture haven't yet learned that. It takes time to develop norms and psychological coping behaviors with the kind of environment we live in. We already have enough trouble handling the industrial era. And now we're getting another era. And probably while we're trying to adapt to whatever we call this current era, it's going to be another era too. If we're adding an entirely new social medium every decade, and it takes 20 years before we figure out how a social medium is supposed to work in our lives, we're going to be constantly in this situation. And maybe that is also something one can adapt to. In many ways, this is kind of a first world problem. This is great. We have too much stuff going on. The thing that we fear, I think, is missing something really important. And I think one of the cool insights from the effective altruism movement is that typically the importance of different projects and things is quite often power law distributed, which actually does mean that if you don't work on the most important thing, you might be missing out on most of the value. This is, of course, even more stressful once you start thinking about that. If this might not be true for Netflix movies, the best one and the second best one are probably actually equally nice. But in terms of the information you should learn or your career choice, that might be quite important. And the remedy is, of course, to actually spend more time on reflecting and evaluating and trying to figure things out. And we don't have a good set of tools for that. So this might be an area both for the kind of hope. Can we develop this? Can we learn these skills? And of course also entrepreneurship. There's probably a lot of money in developing those tools that help us evaluate more efficiently and more reliably, or even just isolate ourselves from the general noise and just find the good enough awesome sources of information and entertainment and opportunities we see.
Too much goodness isn't necessarily goodness.
He said it's better than non-alternative. Yeah, very interesting everything you're talking about. Thank you a lot. And I have so many questions. I'm trying to think how to phrase it into one. You're talking about hope, and you're talking about risk. Risk is something negative. It's based on scenarios, just as is hope. So what my experience is, it's people are talking about risks in a negative way and forget, as you say, many good things come out. And then you have power, I don't mention any politics or whatever, who takes charge of this and uses it. So how can we keep the hope up within people? Because if it's constantly feeding with a downside of what's happening, then people lose hope. And hope, if you lose that, you restrain fantasy, entrepreneurship, and actually both sides. I mean, risk is just to identify, do we have a threat? What's the risk with it? How are we going to assess it? Are we going to assess it with fear or with hope? And then once you have the hope, how stop doing it into becoming a religion and a dream? I mean, where's the reality in it? It's easy to use risk and threats to manipulate people, to say you have to pay more for, I mean, like say, wind power. I'm not pro it because there's lots of things to it. There are other alternatives too. And then you have the hope for something good. But people who are finding a solution to something also try to restrain other ideas. So how do you keep up with this mental altruism and the hope and let everybody talk? It's so easy that I'm a scientist. I'm just talking for my thing. So how do you keep that alive and not just becoming a dream, because it can turn into a nightmare? I don't know. I don't know whom to ask, but
does anybody feel? Go for it, Risto.
I don't know if I have a good answer, but a few thoughts. One is I would encourage people to be like, we should teach people to be more critical thinkers. That if we read some article which title says, for example, AI will kill us all, I would recommend people not to kind of agree with that immediately and like feel emotionally that, oh my God, AI will kill us all, but actually like check what the arguments are, or what's the evidence for that, what are the reasons for that.
Unless Anders or I have written it. In this case, you just believe it.
When they have written, then be especially critical. So that's one thought. Another thought is that, for example, selling hope, I think you also alluded to that, selling hope can actually also be negative. For example, I feel like AGI companies that are trying to develop artificial general intelligence, they are trying to sell a lot of hope. They are trying to sell a lot of utopia. They're talking about, oh, we are developing this amazing technology that we could use to solve all kinds of global pressing issues. But they don't actually have evidence for that. They are just experimenting, they're trying, they're essentially selling some kind of hope. And I think we should be somewhat skeptical of that as well, so that we don't, perhaps this actually leads to very negative outcomes. So not necessarily good answers, but a few thoughts.
I guess one interesting question is, are you running away from something or towards something? And is that something concrete or some general direction? A lot of risks are very nice and convenient because they're specific risks, and that means that in a post-ideological society you can get everybody to agree we need to reduce that risk, and that's why you get a lot of risk avoidance. Then you have the more diffuse threats, which are politically very effective because you can get a lot of people to move in your direction because you pretend you can protect against it. But on the other hand, diffuse hopes are quite powerful because a lot of people are trying a lot of different things. That is actually where you get a lot of innovation. More specific hopes might be good for Apollo projects where you actually implement something and focus on it. But they are also, again, more controllable. There is an interesting asymmetry, and I think we can learn a little bit about the general game theory about hope and risk.
Yeah, so I think it very obviously a thought-provoking and interesting question. I'd wanted to pick up on one thing that both of you brought out about the idea of power, and I think both visions of hope and visions of risk are both incredibly powerful and political. Like the idea of what we should be doing in response to AI, or what kind of futures we should create with possible, technical capabilities that we get. Those are all very. There's no agreement on that. those are open questions, those are powerful questions, and those are very political questions. And hopefully, you know, some of the increased exposure over the last few months and years will lead to more people kind of debating those, like what kind of futures do we want to create, and obviously not just for AI, but across several other issues, like several other emerging technologies like biology and so on. But yeah, I just wanted to really highlight this idea that, like, when you're kind of describing a future, whether it's a hopeful one or like a kind of despairing, like risky one, that's like a political act that one is doing, and yeah, a very powerful one, and one that needs to be debated in public.
It made me think about something that Hans Rosling said, that like the antidote to it seems like we human beings have an overly negative or overly pessimistic view of the world, and the antidote to that is not like introducing an overly optimistic view of the world. It's like introducing an accurate worldview. And he then goes on to talk about himself as a possibilist, not an optimist. So like saying that things are bad, but they are getting better, and they can become even better, and in the end they can become really, really great. And I think it's a word I like, possibilist.
I thought it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on ideas on how people could contribute in your field. So yeah, maybe you can share a few projects or research ideas that you would love to work on yourself, but you just haven't found the time for it yet.
I'm sure Anders has no idea.
On my whiteboard in Oxford, I have a long list of half-finished papers, and on top says, I need a co-author for this one, maybe you. And those are just the projects that are finished enough that they actually are a paper. There are many interesting things that I think are really important that you need to work on. One is coming up rapidly with better ways of handling our collective epistemic system. As we've seen over the last few years, we have a problem with how information flows around in our civilization, and we need to make our civilization better at its internal critical thinking, filtering, perception, decision making. And that might involve both social institutions and the technological ones. And there is a lot of interesting ethics involved there. That's a big, big, big question with a lot of sub-questions. Another one is, of course, thinking better about systemic risk. We don't have any great tools at all for thinking about systemic risk in different domains. But systemic risks are super important. They might actually represent the bulk of the risk we're getting. While the more specific ones, the asteroid impacts, so to say, they are fairly easily manageable. We kind of know how to handle that kind of risk, but we don't have the tools for thinking well about systemic risks. And similarly, differential technology development is a thing I'm championing. In many technologies, we can foresee bad uses and bad side effects. But we can kind of speed up technologies that diffuse those bad sides. For AI risk, there is AI safety work. In the case of biorisk, there might be biocontainment and rapid development of vaccines, etc. Can we turn differential technology development into an effective system with funders, people looking out for technologies, listening to the Luddites and then stealing their ideas to stop that thing and being entrepreneurial about making the company that sells the solution to the problem the Luddites found? That sounds like it could be quite valuable.
Building up on what Anders was saying about systemic risk, I would really like people to work on trying to think about how to measure systemic risk or societal level risk, how to make it more tangible, clear for policy audiences, for example, what counts as a societal level harm, because some harms like a self-driving vehicle, for example, killing somebody, we can very clearly understand what that harm is like. But societal level harm is a very new concept, and in law there's no precedent for that. So I would encourage people to work around that. Another thing I would be very excited about is how to, for example, operationalize some legal requirements from the EU AI Act or related kinds of legislations, how to operationalize them, how to create specific guidelines for companies to follow to meet those requirements in law. For example, law might say that a system has to be safe, robust, accurate. First of all, we need to set some kind of benchmarks for what kind of accuracy you want, for what kind of systems, and how can companies actually meet that? What kind of risk management procedures should they follow? There's a lot of AI standards related work that could benefit from that research. And also similarly, what kind of institutions could be set up to enforce regulations? If we want to develop an AI office or an AI agency or even a global international AI organization, how should we set that organization up? Like, what should that institution have? If we want to audit large language models and general purpose AI systems to determine what vulnerabilities they have, how should we do that auditing? There's a lot of room for thinking around that.
Yeah, maybe just a few practical things to end on. So I think the field of kind of existential risk has improved a lot over the last 6 years or whatever that I've been involved in. There's a lot more ways to get involved, in terms of summer research fellowships or master's programs or PhD, doing PhDs, things like that. And that's just within the kind of like narrow academic research kind of field of it. Beyond that, people should check out a great website called 80,000 Hours, which does careers advice for other kinds of options. But I would say that you don't have to be within the specific little world of academic research to contribute to these issues. I think there's loads to be done. So just picking up on the auditing thing, this is coming down the line in the US and the EU. If there will be this huge new market of AI assurance, AI auditing. If it's anything like the cybersecurity market, it's going to be multi-billion dollar market. 4 or 5 billion is what the UK government thinks it could be. There aren't yet, that hasn't been captured by, it's not clear which companies are going to provide those services. There's a lot of great, there's a lot of great companies to be built there. And then, so that's as kind of, as entrepreneurs, as citizens, we can get involved by, writing to our MEPs if you are still in the EU, and telling them you want them to support the EU AI Act, or further as citizens. I think one of the things to be optimistic around climate change is school strikes, Extinction Rebellion, the kind of increase in interest from citizens. Starting in kind of around 2018 and really picking up in 2018. So I think there's huge amounts that we can do in the kind of narrow academic research world, and then as entrepreneurs, as business people, as citizens.
Thank you. I think it was here.
Yeah. So building on that and what we can do. I feel very hopeful because of this event today, and that inspires me to want to kind of act and do something. And specifically, what I think could be quite impactful is to have other people, if what you're saying is true, have other people feel a lot of existential hope. So my question is a bit random. Do you have any movies or any content recommendations that you think would actually inspire existential hope in a lot of people? And maybe if not, do you think there are any good moments of history, for example, where you could create content, where some Netflix script creators could create a really inspiring, hopeful show about existential hope?
Well, while I'm getting the mic, I'm just going to peg Letters from Deep Utopia from Nick Boström. I think it's excellent.
One mainstream movie that is actually shockingly hopeful is Her. It actually depicts the singularity in a somewhat romantic way. And it's an interesting story because it's actually about very friendly AI. And it is showing a future in Los Angeles that actually seems to be fairly livable. It's kind of a quiet thing, but I think it's important to have that. Of course, most people making a story want drama, and it's usually easy to make drama if something is bad. I think there is a story that the standard story consists of a man falls into a pit and then he gets out of it. That, I think it was Kurt Vonnegut said that is essentially all stories. And there is something important there, of course, but usually people assume that I need a really deep pit to make it interesting. But of course, quite a lot of the biggest and hardest problems we have is when there are different tensions between different good things. So the big hopeful story that has shaped my life a lot is Olaf Stapledon's Star Maker. We're talking weird science fiction from the early 1930s here. It's the grandest of all grand futures. And it's full of civilization meeting the sticky ends left and right. The entire universe is literally, and they end up as dystopias. And it's still hopeful. That is kind of the grandest form of hope. But it's probably not for anybody because it's kind of dry reading.
One TV show that comes to my mind is called Next. And why I would recommend that maybe is the AI that took over, wanting to take over, wasn't super intelligent. It was like quite stupid sometimes, and it wasn't able to take humanity over. So that was hopeful.
That's like saying the Terminator because they didn't kill every single human. Maybe I'll just say, I think there's a lot of possibility for way more films, TV shows, and things to be made that are kind of, well, one, kind of telling fictional stories about kind of hopeful things, but then also historical events, to just pick up on that. There was a documentary called "The Man Who Saved the World" about Stanislav Petrov, who was the Russian soldier who decided, oh, I don't think those are really nuclear missiles, and decided not to press the response button. But there hasn't been like a fictional kind of like little thing following his life. I think that would be really cool. Wild that there hasn't really been one on Arkhipov, who was another Russian who didn't make a mistake and saved the world. So he was on a submarine in 1962 in the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the like air conditioning on the submarine cut out, and they're like down there. They're being depth charged by the US Navy, so it's exploding, and they're like all sweating, and they can't breathe, and they're like having low-level carbon monoxide poisoning. And the commander of the submarine is like, okay, this is it, it's World War III, let's press the button. And he was like, no, I think not. I think we need to wait for orders from Moscow, which is great because it his loyalty to bureaucracy saved the world. But so like there hasn't been a movie made about Arkhipov, and like that's wild. Like make that movie. So those are just like two little nuclear thoughts.
We're gonna have one last question. Also, just like when we have Risto here from Future of Life Institute, check out their world builds. They're really, really, really cool. Yeah, we'll finish off here.
Burning question. I have like the suspect that this hope is based on belief that technology could help in that. But let me throw on the table this suspect that maybe it's possible that technology is actually the opposite of what can take us to a good in a good direction. Like, look at us. I'm super quick. Look at us. I mean, the white glare of our eyes. How the hell can it be an advantage, right? Weakness, not the strength that technology provides us, is our evolutionary strategy. We're showing the viscera to the opposite, the enemies and dangers. Our strategy is weakness. What do you think?
I think our strategy is adaptability. We use technology, we use social innovations, we use economics to achieve various things, and quite often mess things up rather badly. Learn from that, and then do it less badly, or at least do a new mistake next time. So we are definitely not the strongest species on the planet, but we're kind of running the planet for good and ill because we're smart, adaptive. And a lot of our thinking is not even thinking. Most of the time we're not much smarter than ChatGPT because we're just doing what we did last time or repeating what other people around us do. But that still works, and those moments when we come up with some old ideas, that's enough because they get to spread, and we can then actually affect the future.
I have some sympathy toward what you said, because, for example, I don't know if we could make large language models and these kinds of systems so safe that we would want to integrate them to every economic activity and get all of these amazing benefits that we are hoping that we would get from that. What if that actually is a completely false idea? Because I don't think right now we have evidence that, we have some evidence that we can make them safer. We can measure that based on some benchmarks, but can we achieve the levels of safety that are required in case we want to integrate that into every kind of activity that we're interested in? So I have some sympathy toward that, and maybe instead we need a new paradigm that, some types of technologies we shouldn't actually build, and we might want to switch towards, building, say, very narrow AI systems, and that we are able to control.
Oh yeah, nothing really to add on this particular point, but just wanted to say thank you so much all for coming and for these excellent questions. They've made me more existentially hopeful, and I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion afterwards.
Amazing. I think we'll end on that. So if you had a question and didn't have your time to ask it now, don't fret. These amazing guys will spread out through the locale here, and you can go find them. Before that, I suggest you take some vegan tacos, and everything you need to know is don't go into the podcast thingy because I will hunt you down, and you need to be out of here by 9 o'clock. But apart from that, have a good time, and a big round of applause for you. And Beatrice has something to say.
I do want to say something, because there was a question that I felt very like I have to add on, which was your question, Anton. Hopeful content, existentialhope.com. We have an X-Hope library where we've collected a bunch of hopeful content. So that's what I suggest your next online visit goes there. And yes, so should we say like the topics that you guys will be focusing on?
Well, we're all over the place. I'm all over the place, but of course I'm very interested in grand futures. Just how big and good could the future be?
Yeah, I can talk about anything, but if you want to talk about AI policy, EU AI policy, I'm game.
Again, could talk badly about anything, but I guess existential risk in general. Maybe some of the non-AI ones, if people are keen to just talk about those. Obviously, AI is the most interesting one at the moment, but if people want to talk about the other ones.
Thank you, and sorry for interrupting you, Ville. Now, tacos and talk.
Thank you.
Ja, det var inte så mycket övervakare. 5 stycken inom.